From the sleek glass of your iPhone to the cotton of your t-shirt, from the furniture in your living room to the tiniest gadget on your desk, one phrase appears again and again. Made in China. It's everywhere. It's routine. It's invisible. Yet behind those three words lies a story few truly understand. A story of ambition, strategy, and transformation on a scale almost impossible to imagine. Think about it. Every day, billions of people interact with products stamped with this label, often without a second thought. We scroll past it while unboxing our new gadgets. We glance over it while unpacking our clothes from online orders. It feels mundane, even ordinary. And yet, this label is a symbol of one of the most extraordinary economic shifts in modern history. A shift so subtle, so seamless, that most of the world didn't even notice it happening. How did a nation, once dismissed as poor, fractured and irrelevant, embed itself so deeply in our lives that escaping it seems impossible? How did China go from being on the world's periphery to becoming the invisible backbone of global manufacturing? To answer this, we have to imagine a world that doesn't recognize China's potential. Picture the mid-20th century, a nation recovering from decades of civil war, famine, and foreign invasions. Cities were rebuilding from rubble. Rural communities struggled to survive on meager crops. For the rest of the world, China seemed like a distant, immobile giant, incapable of competing with the industrial powerhouses of the West. Investors looked elsewhere. Economists dismissed it. And yet, in the shadows, something extraordinary was brewing. China's rise was not sudden, it was quiet, calculated, invisible to the casual observer. While the world focused on profits, politics, and post-war reconstruction, China began plotting its transformation into a manufacturing colossus. It wasn't about flashy announcements or dramatic headlines. It was about patient, precise strategy, laying the groundwork for a revolution that would touch every home, every office, every corner of the globe. The story of this label is not just a tale of economics. It's a story of cunning, planning, and ambition. Every Made in China sticker you see today carries with it the echo of a nation that refused to be ignored, that quietly studied the world, learned its patterns, and turned them into tools of unparalleled influence. After the devastation of World War II, China was a nation in ruins. Cities lay in rubble. Millions of families were displaced, and famine loomed over the countryside like a silent predator. The streets of once thriving towns were empty, the markets barren, and the factories that remained struggled to produce even the simplest goods. For the rest of the world, China was a forgotten nation, an enormous, unstable land, teetering on the edge of collapse. Economists wrote it off as irrelevant. Foreign investors looked elsewhere, choosing nations they considered safer, more reliable, more profitable. Superpowers paid little attention. The global narrative was clear. China was a sleeping giant, yes, but a weak one, incapable of influencing the modern world stage. Yet even in this darkness, seeds of change were quietly taking root. In the shadows of crumbling cities and impoverished villages, a new generation of leaders began to envision a future that defied expectation. They saw potential where others saw failure, and opportunity where others saw hopelessness. The world believed it was safe to ignore China, but behind closed doors, a leader was preparing to rewrite its destiny. The stage was set for audacious reforms that would transform the nation from a struggling backwater into the engine of global industry. The twist? No one outside the country noticed these subtle moves. While Western nations counted their post-war victories and economic growth, China was quietly plotting a strategy that would one day put the entire world's supply chains under its control. 1978 marked a turning point, not just for China, but for the world. A man named Deng Xiaoping, a pragmatic and visionary leader, took the helm and whispered a bold idea that would forever change global history. Open China to the world. Bring your factories here. At first, the proposal sounded almost absurd. For decades, China had been isolated, focused inward, recovering from years of turmoil. The West had long dismissed it as too chaotic, too poor, too unprepared for modern industry. But Deng's vision was different. He saw China not as it was, but as it could be, a nation poised to harness its vast population, untapped labor, and strategic geography to build an industrial powerhouse. The West, hungry for cheap labor and cost-effective production, didn't hesitate. Factories, big and small, started migrating to China. Clothing brands, electronics manufacturers, and toy producers all rushed in, eager to capitalize on the low wages and massive workforce. It seemed like a simple win-win. The West got cheaper products, China got jobs. But this was only the surface. Behind the scenes, China was quietly absorbing every lesson, every process, every industrial secret the West brought with it. While Western companies believed they were exploiting cheap labor, China was learning, adapting, and preparing to take control of the entire chain of production. It was a calculated dance of perception and strategy. The world thought it was using China, but the real question was, who was really using who? China's doors were open, yet the nation inside was quietly transforming, building the foundation of what would become an empire of manufacturing, logistics, and supply chain mastery. By the time the rest of the world realized what was happening, the stage had already been set for a revolution in global economics. As Western companies poured into China, the floodgates of global manufacturing swung wide open. Factories sprang up almost overnight, churning out clothing, toys, electronics, and more at speeds that seemed impossible. Profits soared in the West, stocks climbed, CEOs celebrated the brilliance of outsourcing. But while the West was mesmerized by cheap labor and immediate gains, China had quietly set a trap, a masterclass in strategic patience. Every shipment produced, every process learned, every assembly line observed became part of a silent lesson plan. Engineers studied techniques, factory managers memorized workflows, supply chains were mapped and optimized. What the West saw as exploitation, China saw as research and development. The country learned not just to produce cheaply, but to produce efficiently and reliably at scale. Skills that would soon make it irreplaceable. Every factory floor was a classroom, every foreign company a teacher. And by the time Western corporations realized the depth of what was happening, China had already mastered the systems that powered global trade. The twist? Outsourcing was no longer just a cost-saving measure for the West. It had inadvertently become the key to China's meteoric rise. While executives celebrated quarterly profits, a quiet empire was growing beneath their feet, a factory-driven juggernaut that would eventually dominate electronics, machinery, and even technology the world once thought untouchable. It was a subtle but unstoppable transformation. The West thought it was winning, but in the shadows, China was building an empire. While the world marveled at China's cheap labor and rapid production, something far more profound was happening, mostly invisible to foreign eyes. Behind the factory walls, the nation was quietly reshaping itself, laying the groundwork for an industrial revolution that would stun the world. Megaports rose along the coast, stretching for kilometers, capable of handling ships that dwarfed anything the West had ever built. Highways snaked across the country, connecting remote towns to manufacturing hubs. Entire cities seemed to spring from the earth, housing millions of workers, factories, and distribution centers, all planned with meticulous precision. The scale was breathtaking, and yet the world barely noticed. Executives were content with cheap prices and fast turnaround times. Economists applauded growth, but they underestimated the silent force building beneath the surface. Every bridge, every port, every factory floor was a strategic move, a step toward controlling the arteries of global commerce. By the time global companies began to realize the magnitude of China's infrastructure, its unparalleled logistics, workforce concentration, and production efficiency, it was already too late. The networks were entrenched. Supply chains were tied irrevocably to China. The nation's quiet ambition had transformed into invisible dominance. The twist? This was not just about speed or efficiency. It was a carefully orchestrated strategy. Build more than factories. Build the entire backbone of modern manufacturing, and ensure that the world would soon depend on it entirely. Shenzhen, once a small fishing village, became the symbol of a new era. Designated as a special economic zone, it transformed almost overnight into an industrial powerhouse. Factories multiplied, assembly lines hummed around the clock, and the pace of production astonished even the most optimistic observers. But China wasn't just producing toys, clothes, and cheap electronics anymore. Soon, entire industries began to flow through its factories. Advanced electronics, machinery, automotive parts, and eventually high-tech components that the world once assumed only Western nations could manufacture. The country's reach spread from consumer goods to the very backbone of modern technology. Here's the twist. China's influence wasn't just about volume, it was about control. Supply chains that stretched across continents now had their central hub in one nation. Raw materials, manufacturing processes, logistics, and shipping were all interwoven into a network that only China could fully manage. If a single link faltered, the world felt the impact. The West, addicted to low prices and fast delivery, barely noticed the invisible grip tightening. By outsourcing, they had unknowingly handed the keys to global production over to China. The world was hooked, and dependency was growing every day. The consequences of this addiction would not be immediate, but the seeds were planted. A nation once ignored had quietly become indispensable, and the full weight of its influence would only reveal itself in time. For decades, the world believed that China's dominance was built solely on cheap labor. Factories filled with workers assembling electronics, clothing, and toys seemed to confirm the narrative. Low wages, long hours, and relentless output. Companies across the globe celebrated their savings, thinking they had mastered the art of cost-cutting, but the reality was far more complex and far more dangerous for global dependency. Today, China is no longer the cheapest option. Nations like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India now offer even lower wages. So why do companies continue to rely on China? The answer lies not in cost alone, but in control, expertise, and infrastructure. China dominates rare earth minerals critical for electronics and renewable energy. Its workforce is highly skilled, capable of executing complex assembly and high-tech production that few others can replicate. Robotics, AI-powered manufacturing, and state-backed subsidies make its factories faster, smarter, and more reliable than anywhere else in the world. The twist is chilling. Companies aren't just paying for production, they're paying for access to a system that only China can provide. Dependency is no longer about saving a few dollars. It's about survival in an interconnected, high-speed global economy. The West once believed it was calling the shots, but as supply chains tighten, control shifts. The illusion of cheap labor masks a far greater reality. A nation that has strategically positioned itself at the center of global production, wielding influence quietly, efficiently, and inescapably. For decades, the world had quietly surrendered its manufacturing power to China. Cheap labor, sprawling factories, and unmatched efficiency had lured companies into dependence. But eventually the West woke up, and the response was fierce. Trade wars erupted, tariffs slapped on imports. Governments devised the China Plus One strategy, urging companies to diversify manufacturing to countries like Vietnam, India, or Mexico. Headlines proclaimed that the West was taking control back. CEOs promised to reduce risk and bring jobs closer to home. On paper, it seemed like a bold counterattack. Yet reality was far more complicated. Despite the rising costs and political pressure, companies discovered that moving production was easier said than done. China's infrastructure, logistics networks, skilled workforce, and mastery of supply chains couldn't be replicated overnight. Factories in other countries struggled to meet the speed, precision, and scale that China had built over decades. Here's the twist. The harder the West tried to pull away, the deeper China tightened its grip. Companies returned, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. The global economy had grown addicted to the efficiency and reliability of Chinese manufacturing. Every attempt to escape only reinforced China's indispensable position. In the battle for control, China had anticipated every move. The West believed it was striking back, but in truth it was playing into China's hands, validating the decades of strategic planning and infrastructure investment that had made it irreplaceable. For decades, China had been viewed as the world's copycat, a nation that could replicate technology, manufacture products cheaply, and dominate global supply chains through sheer volume. But a quiet revolution was underway. The country that once relied on imitation was transforming into a leader in innovation, turning the rules of the game on their head. From sprawling EV factories to 5G networks that connect millions in milliseconds, and from AI-powered assembly lines to cutting-edge robotics, China began asserting control not just over quantity, but over the future of technology itself. The nation was no longer content to manufacture what others designed. It was creating the designs, the systems, and the infrastructure that would define the next era of industry. The twist, the very world that had once laughed at China's copying skills now found itself dependent on Chinese innovation. Western companies, governments, and consumers relied on Chinese advancements in technology, energy, and high-speed manufacturing. What was once a Made in China label denoting low cost had evolved into a mark of global dominance. China had turned a decades-long strategy of patient learning, infrastructure building, and strategic patience into a weapon far more powerful than cheap labor: technological leadership. And with this weapon, the nation could influence markets, industries, and even geopolitics in ways the world had never imagined. The story of China's rise is no longer subtle. From the clothes we wear to the electronics we use, from essential medicines to the microchips powering the devices that run our world, nearly every supply chain runs through China. The nation that was once written off as weak and irrelevant now quietly holds the levers of global commerce in its hands. The shocking twist? Dependence has turned into something far deeper than mere reliance. It is submission. Governments, corporations, and consumers alike are at the mercy of a single nation's decisions, policies, and production capacities. A natural disaster, a political decision, or a supply disruption in China can ripple across continents, grounding planes, halting factories, and slowing economies. The West, once confident in its ability to dictate the rules of trade, finds itself constrained. Alternatives exist on paper, but China's mastery of infrastructure, skilled labor, and technological innovation makes replacement almost impossible. The world has become entangled in a system it barely controls, a network engineered over decades with patience, precision, and foresight. Every Made in China label carries with it more than a product. It carries the weight of decades of strategy, ambition, and dominance. What began as cheap labor has evolved into global leverage, and the consequences are profound. If one nation can control what we wear, what we use, and even what we eat, is the world still free? This is not just a story of commerce or economics. It is a story of power, strategy, and the subtle forces that shape our everyday lives. And for billions of people, the answer to that final question will define the decades to come.